we're focusing on fast fashion. And so just a note is that if you have any questions for the panelists as the panel goes on, there are instructions for how to submit a question that we will receive, and then we can pose it to the panelists as we go through the questions. And so just to overview this panel, what we're going to be discussing is fast fashion at a glance. What do you need to know about the issue and the crisis? We will introduce our individual speakers, Sylvia Heisel, Laura Sansone, and Ben Davis. And then we will also have a discussion, which is what the panel is mainly going to be focused on. So really to give an overview of the fast fashion crisis, it's important to know a couple key factoids to kind of get us all on the same page. The first is really defining fast fashion. So fast fashion describes when clothing designs move quickly between designer, manufacturer, catwalk, and stores, and ultimately takes advantage of transient trends. And so it really refers to this very quick turnover of designs for fashion, and then goes to the consumer, et cetera, and then back to the designer. And so the thing about this trend, this crisis essentially, is that it's associated with many detrimental environmental impacts and exploitative and dangerous labor practices. And so fast fashion, for example, leads to a lot of water pollution, chemical pollution, land degradation, and an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And so just to give a couple key factoids, the fast fashion industry is very, very large. It's estimated to be about $30.58 billion. And essentially a lot of these clothing materials are made with plastics such as nylon and polyester, and a lot of these contribute to a whole lot of problems. And also in terms of water usage, for example, a single t-shirt requires about 2,700 liters of water to produce, and so this uses a lot of water from our ecosystem. Another thing is that fast fashion is very reaching in the sense that there are a lot of people that produce fast fashion items that are essentially made by young children and women especially. And so there are a lot of, in terms of increasing sustainability in the fast fashion world, there are actually a lot of inaccurate claims, whether it's recycled polyester or something that a lot of these fast fashion brands like to perpetuate. These are actually a lot of the times inaccurate. In fact, 59% of the claims made by these brands that pertain to sustainability are actually inaccurate. And also in addition to fast fashion, because of these transient trends, we essentially buy these clothes, use them for maybe a couple times, and then it ends up in the landfill, or maybe it lands up in the incinerator. And so actually the fast fashion crisis entails the production of 92 million tons of textile waste. And so clearly this crisis has a lot of detrimental impacts. And so to introduce our panelists, who will hopefully give a lot of insights into the crisis, but also sustainable approaches and ways to solve the fast fashion crisis. The first is Sylvia Heisel, who is the creator of the Design Lab for Fashion Technology. And she specifically specializes in 3D printing of clothing and digital fashion. She also uses Web3 and blockchain technology. She's currently working on a Web3 brand that celebrates women in STEM through digital, physical, and experiential products, and gives back to the advancement of education for women and girls. And these are her social media handles, if you're interested in learning more about her work. Our next panelist is Laura Sansone, who is the creator of the New York Textile Lab, which is a design and consulting company that supports environmentally responsible textile methods and regional systems of production. She is an assistant professor of textiles at Parsons School of Design, and she specifically specializes in bringing New York designers and farmers together to create a decentralized regenerative textile supply network. And also her Textile Lab's Regional Yarn Source Book is a collection of locally sourced and produced yarns that link apparel, products, and interior designers to a regional network of farms and fiber processing mills. Also, Laura is the founder of the Carbon Farm Network, which is a cooperative that connects designers to climate beneficial fibers grown on New York State farms practicing carbon farming, which we hope to learn more about during this panel. Next, and last but not least, we have Dr. Ben Davis, who is a professor of chemical engineering at the Cooper Union. He is an expert in sustainable process design, or the creation of safe, efficient, and environmentally friendly manufacturing facilities. He has identified performance limits for networks of chemical reactors and specifically specializes in assessing the sustainability of corporations. And within this realm, focusing on sustainability, he has made a lot of emphasis on the economic, environmental, and social impacts of manufacturing. His research work has focused on bioprocess design, biofuels, and operations, and he serves as an active member of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers. So with that, we clearly have a very well-rounded panel, I would say, with experts specializing in very different aspects of the fast fashion crisis. And so with that, we would like to start asking our questions.
Oh, great.
And again, just reminder with the Menti, if there's any kind of clarifying questions that you would like to ask, feel free to go to menti.com and enter the code below, and then we can receive those questions and post them to the desk.
All right, so welcome everyone. I'm Naira, grad student over here at Weill Cornell. Thank you so much for attending today. The first question we have on the table for our amazing panelists is, when did you realize the fast fashion crisis was actually a crisis? And how did that motivate you to begin implementing more sustainable solutions and actually integrate that into your work? So we'll start with Laura.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think what really hit it home for everybody, me included, and most people who are involved in the industry, was the Rana Plaza collapse. I see that as like a threshold moment, you know.
For sure.
And for those of you who need to be reminded of that, it happened in 2013, and it was a manufacturing hub in Bangladesh that collapsed. It was in violation of building codes, and I mean, over 1,000 people died. It's a horrible event, and I think that really jarred the fashion industry into, you know, saying that like we are responsible for this human rights abuse, really. So. I think that was like a turning point in general, but I was already really interested in practicing like this idea of soil to soil production, where like things could come out of the ground and be made into clothing and then go back into the ground. Yeah. So, you know, I've been busy doing that for quite a while, in different manifestations.
Yeah. And Ben, what do you think?
So yeah, probably starting in graduate school is when I started to be aware of things like planetary boundaries and what sustainability is. And generally you learn about what I now call, for my students, we have a global pollution epidemic. And fast fashion is kind of more a symptom of that than it is like a holistic thing. It's something that, you know, we are seeing in a lot of natural systems and a lot of different industries. So generally, like, I've seen it much more with students choosing to look at projects that are involving fabrics or involving fast fashion, being more interested in that as an environmental problem. So that's kind of where I started getting into it, was in graduate school and learning basically about a lot of the environmental crises that we are experiencing.
Yeah, very interesting. And that's what Nellie said.
Yeah, so I think there were two big milestones for me of kind of aha moments on this. The first was that I had a previous career to working with fashion technology, which was as a designer, and I had my own brand, and made, you know, clothes, women's evening wear, sold to a lot of stores. And at a certain point in my personal life, I became really interested in sustainability. And then it was like, oh my God, I'm part of the problem. We're making all these samples that are for clothes that are never going to get made, and the whole thing. And that was really a start of my transitioning to working between fashion and tech, because I saw that as a way to, as something that could solve some of this, and became really interested in how can we use technology to solve some of the sustainability problems with fashion. And then I think my second time of that, where fast fashion really hit me, was that right before COVID, my very last travel or speaking or anything was in Singapore at a conference on Industry 4.0, and I was there with, you know, was the people making the robots and the giant industry, you know, big business, big industry, talking about 3D printing. And then I also met with the Southeast Asian director for Fashion Revolution. And that was like, wow, like this is, hearing her stories and hearing about what it is really like in these factories and what do these workers go through and what is that environment like? And then realizing that, okay, I'm here talking about the robots that are gonna put these women out of work also. And that's still really a kind of hard point for me of, we have to be really conscious of how we're going forwards with technology. But really like hearing these stories and being up close to them was like, like just tremendously eye-opening.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Shall we go to our next
absolutely.
question? But thank you guys. That was, each of you have a very unique path, and it's really inspiring to see. So let's kind of jump into strategizing, right? We've highlighted that there's an issue here, and each of you have discovered it your own separate ways. But like, what strategies do you guys think exist to make the manufacturing aspect of fashion more sustainable? I know Sylvia kind of began touching on that. And what are the problems with the current processes? Can you tell us a little bit more? So why don't we start with Laura first, if you have.
Sure. I mean, I think the ultimate problem is the linear model, that clothing and textiles follow. It's this extraction, consumption, and waste model that, of course, is underpinned by our economic system. And there's also a growthism model that, it's the way we organize our businesses. So, we have to have this unfettered growth, So those are big problems. I mean, for me, like this, in terms of strategizing, new models, I think that we really need to look at scale, for one, and how to bring scale into a realm that's more of like a human scale that enables us to create interdependencies between different systems. Because this linear model does not do that at all. The linear model is just really about profit and extracting and consuming. So for me, I am a true believer in bioregionalism and bringing back like a local kind of way to develop and manufacture clothing. And we have a long way to go because we've outsourced for decades, but I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I think that approach is like often cited when we talk about sustainability. So I always think of it like sustainable farming, for example, like buying your groceries from like a local farm as opposed to, going to a huge supermarket where they outsource for many, many different things so that your carbon footprint's smaller. So what I'm understanding is, like from your perspective, right, we want to figure out ways to have locally produced clothing so that we aren't fully outsourcing. Okay, that's really great.
Right, and when you design and develop things within a bioregional kind of context, you're working with the capacities and limitations.
Yes.
Right, but that's what makes it important, and like, do we have to go out of our bioregion to access cotton or like a material that might not grow in a bioregion that we're used to? Yes, of course, but it's a place to start to create these interdependencies and networks.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? So Laura mentioned the linear model, and I just want to make sure everyone is on the same page about what that is. But essentially, the linear model states that in terms of fashion, basically the clothing is produced, and then in a line it kind of goes to the consumer, et cetera, but then it dies where it ends up in a landfill or something. And so this is different as opposed to a circular economy where the clothing gets reused, repurposed, and it goes back, and so it's more sustainable. Just to clarify.
Thank you, yes.
Yeah, for sure. Ben, what are your thoughts?
So speaking of supply chain, the model, like going backwards on that model, you start with farming, if we're talking about natural fibers, or you start with petroleum, if you're talking about synthetic fibers. And there's issues with those parts of the supply chain. There's distribution and end use at the other end that we're talking about, and that should be more circular. But in the middle, there's fiber preparation, there's yarn spinning, there's fabric weaving, there's bleaching and dyeing and treatment of the fabrics, and then there's assembly. And a lot of the problems in that part of the supply chain are social. There's a lot of risk of injury to the employees. There's a lot of gender inequity in the employees that are working on those sorts of steps. And then especially in bleaching and dyeing, better processes are definitely needed. Like a lot of the materials that we are using in our clothing in this room right now are coming from countries where they don't have strong regulations around use of fossil fuels, around water pollution, around use of their resources. And so thinking about sourcing those materials responsibly and thinking about the way that we are making those fabrics, as Laura said, like the reason that we're bringing it locally is so that we have control and we can think about how are we doing these things, and we take them under the United States regulations of how we're able to handle these sorts of things. And if we, kind of let this be, everybody can do whatever they want, it causes a lot of risk to a lot of people and, can cause a lot of damage.
I see. Yeah. Sylvia, what are your thoughts?
So, I guess I initially, one of the things to me that really attracted me to 3D printing was the concept that you are making things on demand with zero waste. And we are still really, really far away from 3D printed clothes. That's just not there yet. But there is a lot of technology out there, and there's a lot of innovation out there that can bring us closer to a zero waste, and especially to a manufacture on demand, and to, right now, clothing is made at huge volume and textiles and all, because that's the way the supply chain works, and that's how they can get the price so low. And so a lot of it is never even bought. It's never bought, it's never worn. And if we can get closer to what do consumers really want, making it for them without all this waste, getting it to them quickly enough, connecting them more to the product, as well as, so that they are invested in it. That's what fashion should be about. That's kind of part of the magic of fashion, rather than, okay, we all just need to wear clothes.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So Laura mentioned that essentially making sure that fashion is more sourced locally essentially is really important, because then it comes under US regulations. My question for you guys is that a lot of companies outsource because it's cheaper, and so they're able to kind of circumvent US regulations, and so there's profit involved, there's lack of regulation. So my question is, how do you incentivize them to bring their manufacturing local, essentially?
I mean,
Yeah.
The problems, they're cultural, they're political, and they're technical. And we talked about technology, but a lot of it is culture. Like, there has to be a culture that values a durable good over fast fashion. We need to have a consumer base or a set of customers that say, no, I want something that lasts a long time. No, I want something that can be reused or turned into something else. No, I want something that was sourced from a sustainably farmed fiber. Like, that's the start of it, is actually thinking about the choices we make in terms of what we buy. And that is what puts pressure on companies to do things.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great thing to bring up, and like this, the end, that kind of like, the end of that value chain, like, is like the consumer, right? And they're a big part of shifting, this model, and I think I take on a lot of responsibility as a designer, as someone who produces things, because I feel like, it's our role on some level to shift that narrative, like to or embed it, not to shift the behavior by embedding a narrative around, why this article of clothing might cost more, why the price point is higher, the embedded value in that piece of clothing is what I call alternative value flows, like that are beyond just the dollar, value. Because we have to start thinking about beyond the dollar value. I mean, it's just really important, because what happens is and Sylvia touched on this a little bit, we externalize costs, right? And that's what efficiencies do, efficiencies of scale. It's about externalizing the cost of things. And so as a brand, as a designer, we need to actually internalize those costs and be well aware of the impact that we're having when we make stuff. And think about, you know, how we can do that, internalize the cost, you know, like pay people appropriately, you know, in our supply network, you know, supply chain, I call it a network. Pay the people who are growing the fibers properly, pay people who are doing the sewing properly, you know, and if the end product ends up to be a higher price point, how do we start to talk to consumers about that? And it's a challenge because you walk into a big box store and, you know, there are t-shirts that are $5 that, right? So.
I also think that we have to not think of this as, you know, there is a problem in America, but right now fast fashion is growing faster in China than it is in the US. You know, the Chinese economy is exploding, and they have a giant, you know, population of people who can now afford fast fashion and who want it, feel they have every right to it, and so it really needs to be thought of on a global scale, because if we as America just kind of isolate, we're still going to have a climate problem. And I think also the thing of really connecting the end consumer to the people that make their clothes is super important. You know, whether that is in metaverses or in chat rooms or on Facebook or wherever it is, wherever it can occur, but the more sharing, the more information, the more those are real people to us as consumers, and the more they also understand who we are.
That's so great. It's so true. Like, you know, to really, to make those P2P connections.
Yeah.
You know, that's really important. And you know, in a local network, like that's much easier to do that, right? Like, and if you use food as an example of that, like, you know, our green market, our beautiful green market system that we have here in the city, it's like you go there week after week, you see the farmer, you know, you can understand where the farmer comes from, geographically, you know, they hand you the bunch of radishes, right? And what do? You're building a trust relationship with this person who is growing your food, you know, and we need to have that all throughout that value chain.
Wow. Yeah, and you know, I'm hearing that it's going to take a lot of manpower. It's going to take an immense culture shift. That is like a very much the opposite of the way that we kind of view and are right now. But you know, I think there is a lot of hope in the way that we could implement it, and a lot of what you guys touched on was like consumer education and actually connecting with people that are manufacturing clothing. And we have something called social media, which is like a huge tool that we could use, right? And it's a part of the initiative that we took, like as a podcast, and you know, I imagine the initiative of like everyone here, you know, in some way. So speaking of, you know, getting educated, can you guys help us understand the definition of an environmentally responsible material and what a regenerative textile actually is? Laura, why don't you get us started?
So, you know, for me, so like I mentioned soil to soil earlier, and that's really the ultimate, like, we should all be striving for that. You know, we should be striving for this model where we're taking out from, we're extracting from the earth and we're putting back in. We have to replace, and this is what climate beneficial practices or carbon farming is about, and this is something that I promote through my work with partnering farms in our region. But it's about whatever we're taking, we're putting back through farming practices, basically, that are designed to take carbon out of the air and store it back in the soil and the plant matter. So, you know, and we're talking about age-old practices like that we've, you know, through our monocultured systems, farming system, we've strayed away from them. But like, it's like composting protocols and rotational grazing and cover cropping, things like that are not hard to implement, really.
Mm.
So that's the ultimate in terms of what I would imagine environmentally responsible.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Ben, what are your thoughts?
So I differentiated between natural materials and synthetic materials. And so an environmentally responsible natural material is sustainably farmed. And that means avoiding fossil energy, means avoiding pesticides, avoiding fertilizers, and farming in a way that's respectful of the land and thinking about what we're taking out and putting back in. Another thing for natural materials is low treatment of dyes, of bleaches, things like that. So it's going to be more environmentally friendly, the less processing it has engaged with. So that's a big thing for being an environmentally responsible material. For synthetic materials, that is like, it's almost, it can't be if it's synthetic. If it's coming from petroleum, like almost by definition, we are taking things out of the slow carbon cycle into the fast carbon cycle. So if we're thinking about synthetic materials that are more responsible, having a high level of renewable energy content, so in terms of the processing and what sort of energy those manufacturers used in all their different steps, that's a big thing. And to be environmentally responsible, you also have to be socially responsible. So it has to be produced in a safe workplace by fairly compensated adults. Like that's an important thing to think about, like who's making that synthetic material. And there's a tool called the HIG MSI, it's Materials Sustainability Index, which has a pretty good catalog, and it's an open source tool that lets you kind of investigate the different impacts of different sorts of material. And that's a pretty good tool. It has some limitations in terms of thinking about end use and disposal and use at care and things like that. But that's a good way, for this audience, if you want to think about like what's a more sustainable material, that HIG MSI index is a good starting point for that.
Excellent, thank you. And Sylvia, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I want to second that one, that, I do think that's a big, as a designer and as brands looking at this, I think the HIG Index and there's some other organizations, but they're probably the biggest, of really going, okay, we're not gonna be scientists, we're not gonna be the ones who are making these decisions. We have to rely on other people for information, but we have to listen and we have to follow them. And getting those out there so that also the consumer is going, oh wait, are they, is this brand following this, really promoting all of that. And I do think, I think the other side of that, there is no perfect solution on any of this. There is no perfect material.
Making things makes waste.
Yeah,
Anytime you make something, it makes waste.
Yeah.
It has to.
There isn't a perfect solution, and each thing is different, and if you make something that's environmentally perfect, but nobody wants to wear it, forget it. Like, you have to also, appeal to what people want, on things, so I think that's part of it. I do, we did a project a few years ago with a 3D printed dress that decomposed.
Wow.
And it was an exhibition piece, it was not wearable, but the idea is, what if you could have clothing which was truly fast fashion, where you wore it, you put it out with the recycling, it biodegraded.
Wow. Yeah,
So, maybe there are other solutions in the future.
for sure.
I wanted to just shake things up a little
Thank you.
by saying that there has been a lot of exposure around the HIG Index, actually, recently, not too long ago, and not only the HIG, but many of the third-party certifications that they are greenwashing, and a lot of it has to do with the lack of autonomy within the people that run the HIG, like they're the people who sit on the board, right? They are themselves brands, right? And so there's a lack of autonomy, and there's also there's a heavy sway toward fossil fuel-based materials with the HIG in terms of the ratings that happen on HIG. So these are things that are really important to look at. You can look at like Fashion Revolution and like, you know, there are organizations that like and Remake.
Apparel, yeah.
Remake is a good one to really dig into that. Fibershed, of course. I'm a Fibershed affiliate, and they're a wonderful organization that works to build regional fiber systems, and they have a lot of information about the greenwashing. You can write to me, and I can point you to some articles that have been written lately around this.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's like, it is really difficult. You're like, yeah, a resource exists out there, but then we don't know if we can trust exactly the information that is out there, and it requires a lot of nuance that sometimes the average consumer like can't muster, for sure. So I think it is really important to hear from the experts, and at the same time figure out like practical ways that you could go about, like as a consumer, just lowering your carbon footprint and just not buying as often. Things like resisting the urge to buy things you don't need.
It's so huge.
Very well put. Yeah.
Right?
How long something lasts and how often you buy something is the number one predictor of its environmental impact, because you're dividing that impact of making that garment over a longer period of time.
Exactly.
And so that's the number one thing, is it's always reduce, reuse, recycle.
Yeah.
The question on that, from the brands and the designers' point of view, is how do you make that sexy?
Yeah, exactly.
How do you make
Well said.
that? How do you make that be something really, really cool and sexy that people want?
Yeah, I think the younger generation, like Gen Z, they are totally. I mean, these are my students, you know, and I see what's happening. Like they're totally committed to like secondhand purchasing.
Yeah.
Clothing, and I love
That's
that.
trendy these days.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. You know, I think it's a way to really show that, you know, that you're actively working to be, you know, a better consumer, like, you know, around the environmental issues, yeah, and I think it's a way to also create like, you know, a unique wardrobe, really, like where you're not just falling in line with everything that's like
For
on
sure.
trend all the time.
Absolutely.
But I also wanted to point the audience to Remake's Fashion and Accountability Report, just in terms for as a consumer, it's a good place to go to. They do a really good job at rating brands. So they did like 58 brands, big you know, brands as well. So they're very rigorous with their rating system.
Yeah.
It's a good place to go.
Yeah, awesome, well said. So, you know, this is kind of, it's really interesting, right? We kind of started touching on this question, right? So how can us consumers are one part of the stakeholders thing, right? But by stakeholders here, we mean, you know, designers, people that do the manufacturing, people that are actually carrying out the processes. How can these stakeholders use this definition of a sustainable textile to inform or invest like in the design or manufacturing and consumption of fashion? So like, how do we guide the people responsible for these processes based on the definitions that you guys said, to really make that change and, you know, work in a more sustainable way?
We haven't mentioned government regulation yet.
Great, now is a great time. Yeah, so tell us more, yeah.
And that's the way you get corporations to change, is political or governmental pressure. There's very little that an individual consumer can do to force a multinational corporation to do anything. But you can put pressure on them, and the best pressure to put on them is political pressure, or the government can actually make them do things and meet different regulations. Part of the problem with some of these issues is that a lot of these garments and the early part of the supply chain is made in Southeast Asia and China and India, where there is not as much governmental pressure on manufacturers to change.
Wow.
And there's very little that the United States government can do, aside from, you know, all sorts of sanctions and things like that, to address these sorts of issues if it is a global or truly global supply chain.
Have you noticed any shifts in governmental response in light of this crisis?
Well, the Fashion Act and the Fabric Act are I'm not sure if either one has been passed yet, but they were like, you know, on the table. in New York State, we just passed the Textile Act. Governor Hochul signed that. That's more for like funding, to help to stimulate regional
Local
manufacturing.
Wow. Okay.
But the Fabric and the Fashion Act are about making things more compliant and restricting things in the industry. Right? So.
Not a lot of optimism and hope on this. I do think, I think on one level it comes back to education. Then we can't control other governments. What we can do somewhat is to help provide education and resources for people in other countries who are in part of the supply chain. I think, that's probably, and then it comes again back to social media of
For sure.
that we can connect the world and we can connect those people that are sewing and that are weaving and that are, at the core of our supply chain, at the start of it, with us. And through that kind of activism on every level, we can begin to influence our governments and our large corporations.
So out of curiosity, can you talk more about the designer perspective? So, going back to the 90s before, I would say many people in this room were born, I think it was early, mid-90s, right? Tom Ford was over at Gucci, and he stated that, there was no need for mini collections every 6 weeks. So when we think about Gucci, we're thinking about it as a luxury brand. We're not thinking of it as fast fashion. What I literally have on is an actual vintage Gucci blazer. It's been in existence longer than me for sure. So, when we think about brands like that, we don't think about them as fast fashion. But he's literally saying, at that point, hey, we're designing these mini collections every 6 weeks. We don't even need fashion changing every 6 months. What kind of pressure can we put on designers, especially when we're thinking about some of them at these large fashion houses where, somebody's not going to hear someone saying, I'm not going to produce this for YSL, or I'm not going to produce this for, Helmut Lang. How do we actually apply that kind of pressure? How can designers apply that kind of pressure when a lot of these companies are owned by, investment groups, or they have other stakeholders that they answer to? We talk about stakeholders, it's not just us as consumers. What can we do if somebody still has to design 8 or 9 collections a year, right? There's still clothing going out there.
So on that is one of the areas where there is a lot of innovation, is on the sampling with using digital fashion and creating instead, traditionally when you create a collection, each piece, the designer, it starts with the designer sketch, and then there's the pattern maker and the sample yardage that you're buying, and you're making a sample. It's coming back to the designer is changing stuff on it, a second sample is made, maybe a third sample is made. For an average collection, you're making maybe 250 samples. Of those samples, maybe 50 pieces are actually going into production of it. The rest is just garbage. And you're doing it over and over again. The stores and the retailers expect new merchandise. For retail to work at this point, it needs a constant flow of new merchandise, whether it's physical or e-com. You need to have something new. Most of us, we look and we check all these sites for new clothes, every day. And if there's not something new all the time, we're not interested.
Commodified it. They expect it. Right.
There is a lot of innovation on completely that process is now done digitally in a lot of cases where there are no actual clothes made, where I design clothes on an avatar. They are shown virtually. They are tested out with consumers. I can design 20 pieces. They can look at, the retailer can look at them and go, okay, I want, these 3, they can show it to the whole thing is just digital. It does not involve any manufacturing of actual clothing. Someone released a couple of days ago, they did a metahuman, an avatar, which is an exact copy of Ava Herzig. I'm going to butcher her name, but she's a famous model. And her avatar can now walk a digital catwalk wearing digital clothes, and it is exactly the same experience pretty much as a fashion show. So if Tom Ford can do a collection, if the whole thing can be virtual, and then consumers can say, okay, I want to buy that piece, we're way ahead. We're way, way ahead. It's a lot easier than asking consumers to not shop, not look.
I don't know. For me, I do think there needs to be a cultural shift, though, to the amount of things that we consume. We can't consume what we're consuming. The average American buys 64 garments a year, which is a lot. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it is. It's 5 a month. 5 new things. So much of that ends up getting dumped in the global south. All of it does, really. It's disgusting. If anyone here has seen, what's happening in places like Ghana or in Haiti and these countries that have economies built around used clothing markets. They have for decades been taking in used clothing from the global north, and we sell the market sells the used clothing market sells used clothing in bales. Okay, so it's by weight. Wow. So of course what's happened is those bales get weighed down with totally unusable clothing because you get more money for it, right? And so these big bales of used clothing get sent to these countries, and it's complete total waste. It's all over their beaches, in the streets, used clothing, and it's really horrific. So this thing about keeping the machine, the buying machine go. I think we shouldn't, not having 7 seasons is really important, right? And following more agrarian cycles of this is, so we have I really believe that humans need to connect to nature again. We've been so disconnected from our natural systems, and that's part of the problem that we see with all of the human, our food systems, our energy systems, our clothing systems and fashion. It's that disconnect where we're completely oblivious to really those natural systems. So if and being aware of that is we start to understand the environment and what's happening and these shifts that are happening with climate change, which are very real. So the consumption piece is a problem, and it's something that we have to create a new embodiment somehow, and I'm not sure how to do it. It's other than I'm not sure. I think sometimes I'm okay, things are just gonna have to collapse completely, I go down that road, and I don't want to, be discouraging. But it's just, and I'm someone who's out there doing stuff to actively change, and we all get like that, right? It's insurmountable,
I do want to add that another thing with digital fashion that is coming up is that there's digital fashion that you can try on your phone, and that there's an enormous amount of clothing that gets bought just to wear once on social media. And so if you can wear digital clothing instead, and there is no actual thing, why not?
Yeah.
Why do we have to, maybe the definition of fashion has to change, that fashion doesn't have to be a physical object. It's part of if your identity is online, if your identity is through your social media, then have fun with that.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, for sure. And also new economic models too, like how we grow our businesses and, you know, I mean, what about models like rental models for clothing, right?
Yes, absolutely.
That's something that, you know, or building companies where you have like extended producer responsibility, where you're baking that into your business plan, and you're like, you know, you're gonna take back the product and figure out how to deal with it. I mean, then you'll shift how much stuff you put out there, you know, and I don't know.
Absolutely. No, I mean, this is really great. So what I got from that, and first of all, the next question, right, is basically what you're beginning to touch on, right? How do we make sustainable options more accessible? I heard like rental model, I heard like 3D, you know, printing things and watching them decompose, which is really fascinating. And I also heard, you know, like trying things online first before you buy them. Like, I mean, if we think about the reality of it, it's like Amazon has like a try before you buy now. It's like you try it on, you don't like it, guess what? You don't have to keep it. We're just going to make it really easy to put it right back, you know, where you found it. And, you know, other things that come to mind in my head is like H&M has like a recycling program now. Like you can just throw in clothes that you don't want anymore and they'll recycle them and find a way to work them into their textiles. But I think one thing that I heard from the previous question that was really interesting was, you know, Ben, how you kind of whittled down the problem to a very interesting diplomacy issue, right? Where it's like, you know, how do we, in our country, you know, let's say we have these standards of, you know, fashion and regulation and like environmental sustainability. How do we actually impose that on other people? And I think it's not about imposing. I think it's about creating very strategic and impactful like partnerships, right, between countries, which is completely way beyond any of our own capacity. And now there's like an emerging field called like science diplomacy, where actually scientists can go out and meet scientists and diplomats from other countries and actually forge these collaborations, whether that's to further technology or to create like more sustainable systems, right? If we know that there's like a hub of manufacturing in one area, and we have science to back up, you know, a more sustainable way of producing or manufacturing, et cetera, or even a safer way, then you could actually act as a diplomat, as a scientist, like in your own right, or just as a diplomat in the US. So I thought that was a really interesting perspective. But, you know, continuing the thread of making things accessible, you know, we touched on that, but also how do we upscale the production of textiles that are sustainable? I want to start with Laura here because you know, a lot of your work is around creating these systems, and I feel like you've probably thought about like scalability a lot from a local perspective, at least.
Yeah, can I just elaborate on this question? Because a lot of the sustainably sourced or sustainable brands or clothing pieces, they tend to be more expensive, if you guys notice at places, and so I think it's the question of how do we make this a little bit more enticing to consumers is a really important thing, because fast fashion is so appealing because it's $5 for a trendy shirt and you're good, but maybe it's more expensive for a more sustainably sourced piece. And so kind of the scalability and accessibility are really important for potentially changing that consumer mindset, because most of us are poor.
Yeah. I know.
Relatively.
I know.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you manufacture clothing, like, you know, you pay a lot up front for sampling costs. If you're doing, my experience is doing things like, you know, domestically or locally, like, so it's more expensive to do the sampling. Like, often when you sample overseas, like the sampling costs get embedded or aggregated into like the amount of product that you're making. But I know for me personally, like sampling costs are very high. So to make like something new costs a lot initially, but like if you run the same product for, you know, year after year, it you know, it becomes more affordable then, because you've already paid for your sampling. so I've personally played with like putting things on a sliding scale, purchasing. It's really important for me to make things accessible to a wider audience, not just like wealthy people, you know. Like, so, like, I want someone like me to be able to buy, you know, and I'm the kind of person that will save up I'll save my money if I want to buy, and I'll buy one thing, you know, that is more expensive, you know. And I wish more people would do that, because I think that's a better way to go. You know, I think that, like, experimenting with those models of like how, you know, maybe putting things on a sliding scale, that's very experimental, and I could talk to you about the outcomes of that. Do people always pay the lowest of the slide? Like, not always. I mean, many do, but I do have people that pay more, you know, because they believe in the work that I do, they want to support it, and they believe in paying it forward, you know. You know, again, this is about a collective mentality, which we don't, you know, our culture doesn't perpetuate that. But this idea to really embrace this idea of other, beyond just ourselves and our own ambition. I mean, this is like radical change in thought, you know, like we have to, if we're gonna really tackle the problems that we face, the socioeconomic problems and the environmental problems, we have to start thinking in those terms collectively. So anything that we can do to help to get people to think in those ways, I think is a good thing.
Yeah, and by sliding scale, you mean like people are choosing what to pay for.
Yeah, like I give a range, you know, like that. Like it's really about wholesale pricing on single units. You know.
I see. Yeah, Ben, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, like inequality. Like the fashion industry can't address wealth inequality. It can't address income inequality. And so we're making these decisions, but in the context of an unequal country, an unequal world. And if we're thinking about upscaling things, like you have to charge more for a garment if you're paying employees a living wage.
Yes.
You have to charge more for a garment if you're actually going to treat your workers properly and give them breaks and things like that. Like that's part of it. And so the problem is that now we're talking about costs for a garment that are too high for even someone in a developed country like the United States to afford. And that is not something that fashion can address. That is a different sustainability issue that certainly does need to be addressed. But you know, there's going to be no silver bullet solution to that. It's going to be local. It's going to be people who do find a niche, who are able to find a market for their garments where, you know, people are able to afford them and it works out. But local solutions don't always scale. Like once you have identified, you know, some place where you can do something efficiently, you can't always make it bigger.
Right.
Like if you're doing things sustainably, usually that means there's a certain level at which you can do it, and then no more. You have to identify a different place to do it, or do things differently in a different area. And that's part of the problem with the commodifying and like everybody wanting the same thing at the same time, is that, you know, that's not the way natural systems work. We're disconnecting from that.
I really like what you're saying though. I think that like not being able to make things get bigger is important. Like, you know, like we should only be taking from our workable landscape what is we're able to take and put back appropriately.
Like having
you know?
limits is crucial.
Yeah. So I think that's like a really good thing.
I think, you know, it's a really interesting question, because fashion has had artificial limits that are what makes designer clothing in a lot of cases. That, you know, there's only so much you can do to make a t-shirt different, yet we sell t-shirts that are $5 and t-shirts that are $5,000 depending on the brand label in it. And so if we can bring some of, you know, and fashion is about magic. Fashion it's not just clothing. Everyone in the world wears clothing, but those of us that are fortunate enough to be a little higher up on the socioeconomic scale get to pick what we're gonna wear. And that's where fashion starts. So we have to make sustainability part of that that sexiness that we're picking and what we're choosing, instead of, you know, what a celebrity wore last week, you know, or whatever other, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, to end this really fruitful discussion, we wanted to touch on, and wanted you guys to touch on a little bit, like what technologies are being developed that are going to change the way fashion is made, marketed, consumed, and or repurposed, hopefully. Yeah. Sylvia, why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
think, you know, I think the one that's really impacting the world right now of fashion is digital design.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the one that's on my end really having an actual impact, and it's something that large companies and small companies are doing. And to really have a lot of data in their supply chains and to kind of take advantage of all of that. 3D printing is coming in a lot of the findings, and buttons, trimming, zippers, that kind of thing, solid things, and is innovating in that. It's not there yet for clothing, but it will be. We're doing a lot of work with blockchain now, and how can blockchain be used to really kind of quantify and guarantee supply chains and connect the end consumer with the person making their clothes. And then I'm sort of thinking about, you know, what are the other, there are other things going on in fashion and in clothing that are gonna change what clothing is and how it, you know, there's a lot of interest in functional clothing, and a lot of that gets into things where it's a minefield on sustainability. If your clothing could heat and cool,
Interesting.
would be really, or could change colors.
Yeah.
If it changed colors, you could have just one thing and it looks different each day. If it heated and cooled, we wouldn't need to heat and cool this whole building. We could each be walking around in our own little pod of what's right there and be more comfortable and have less impact on the environment. Those are all things that are in works, but they are minefields of, if we do them incorrectly, we're throwing electronics into our clothes and making the whole thing worse.
Yeah. Yeah, Ben, what do you think?
So focusing on technologies, like what came to mind for me is like Poshmark and, you know, secondhand clothing, like giving the opportunity for people to, you know, to wear the blazer that you're wearing that's lasted 20 years. Like that's a technology that's enabling now. Videos of people like teaching you how to make your own clothes or to modify clothes, like those are enabling. And just like the social media presence and like making people aware of the choices you're making, you know, brands or clothing makers, you know, being able to proclaim to everyone that, okay, I'm doing more responsible things. I am able to market myself in this way and let people see that. Like that's, to me, what's been enabling in the past, you know, 5-10 years, is that now we're able to get so much information so quickly. And so those sorts of innovations, I think, are the way to approach that cultural problem.
Sure.
Those are great answers both. And I think, you know, mending too, that popped into my head in terms of sharing skills on social media, you know, to help extend the life of clothing, you know, keep things, like, you know, as a circular kind of approach. But also this idea of building transparency and traceability, and we were also like looking at, we have a cooperative model that we have put together to meet minimum order quantities to buy fiber and make yarn and make clothing, and we're looking at digital models as well, post blockchain distributed network technology to help us coordinate, you know, like coordinate a supply network and make connections between designers and mills and farms, and to encourage collaboration and cooperative models. And it's all done, you know, through these new Web3 technologies.
Excellent. Yeah.
Patagonia, what they're doing as a B Corp, and things like that, like thinking about governmental structures or organizational structures, cooperative structures. That's how you're able to affect change at the large scale, is by thinking about what the priorities are of the entity that's producing these goods.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. So, yeah, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you guys so much for, all.
Yeah, we gathered a lot of information, as I'm sure that you guys can all agree, from our panelists. And so just to kind of synthesize it a little bit, I just want you to kind of summarize in one key takeaway that you'd like all of our audience members to leave with today, if anything.
One key thing. Well, I think that we should all make, when we're investing in any kind of product, you know, to make the best decision we possibly can in terms of what we're buying. And for me, it's really about, really understanding the provenance of the materials and understanding who made the product. I mean, that for me, that's the most important thing. So I guess that's what I'd like to leave everybody with.
I guess apropos, we're talking about fast fashion. Slow down. Sit for a minute. Decide, do I want this? Do I need this? Is this necessary? Take the time to do the research before you purchase something new to make sure that it is adhering to whatever your values are. Take the time to learn about what you do value and to investigate all these social and environmental costs of these garments. That's the important thing that I would say, is just slow down and take your time, consider.
Yeah, I think also think about fashion as more than just pieces of clothing that you go and you buy and you wear to a party. Rethink, what is fashion? Fashion is the luxury of adorning yourself and having fun with it and really enjoying and feeling good. And so does this, what makes you feel good? Does buying something does buying fast fashion actually make you feel good? When
For
you
a
buy
minute,
something,
maybe.
for
For like
a
a
minute,
minute.
is that, it's like eating fast
Go
food,
ahead.
Doesn't last.
what's gonna really, whether it is, and look at all the different ways you could be feeling more beautiful and adorning yourself and having that luxury, think about fashion that way, and think about how much better you might feel if you knew where your clothes came from, and that might, make you feel better.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much. Can we please thank our wonderful panelists for and then we just wanted to plug our podcast, Politics Under the Microscope. We're available wherever you guys get podcasts, but essentially we have our fast fashion series, and this panel represents a culmination of that series. And so with that, thank you guys so much. If there are any last minute questions, if the panelists are okay with staying a little bit for discussion, that'd be great. But thank you guys again so much for being here. We really appreciate it.